Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of videos here on YouTube to help you play chess better. And I hadn't done one of my own games in a while, so I was showing this game to a student the other day, and I said, wow, this would make a good video. So I'm white, and I'm playing a game in 70 with a 5-second time delay against a 1900 player, Steve S. And let's get right to the game. All right, so I open up English. My last 30 years or so, been playing a lot of English. I guess I play some of the same lines that International Master Bruce Rind used to play. Now I follow some of the modern game books on this opening. Steve decides to play symmetric English, c5, and I play the g3 line. I like to delay putting my knight on c3 to see what he's going to do. Sometimes I put it there, sometimes I don't, depending on what line he plays. Steve plays the symmetric line g6. I play bishop g2. He plays bishop g7. And now I decide to play knight c3. I could play a Botvinnik system here with e4 and knight ge2 and then castle. Black plays d6. So if I want to play a pure Botvinnik here, I can play e4. I could also play knight f3 and then try to play for d4. That's not as much my style here. I play here one of the main lines, but not the main line. I play a3 with the idea of playing rook to b1 and breaking with b4 fairly early. In this position where you have the symmetric pawns on c4 and c5, White's break moves are b4 and d4, and Black's break moves are d5 and b5. Obviously, Black's not going for d5 right away because he already played d6. All right, so after I play a3, Black puts his knight on the most natural square, knight to c6, and I play rook to b1. Not hiding my intention of playing b4. If he wants here, Black could try to play a5. Let's see what Stockfish wants me to play on a5. Let's make the window a little smaller for a minute. Okay. So Stockfish says White should play either e3 or d3 here. Notice he says on e3, I have a slightly more than regular opening advantage, about 4/10 of a pawn. Okay, so Steve didn't play a5. He decides to just let me go ahead and play b4. I'll bring the window back to full size here. Okay, so Steve decides to attack my rook with his bishop. And now I have an interesting choice. I can play kind of conservatively with d3, not creating any weak squares. Or I could win the tempo on the bishop with e4, setting up a Botvinnik system where my rook's already on b1. So I have to decide which one is better. Stockfish right now says that d3 is the better move. I decide to play e4. Stockfish thinks Black should go back bishop d7, where I have a little bit more than a normal opening advantage, maybe 3 or 4/10 of a pawn. He plays bishop to e6 and hits my c4 pawn, but I want to play d3 anyway. And the bishop on e6 means he can't play knight ge7 after he moves the e pawn, which is more common in this position. He has to play knight f6. And then he's going to have two pieces in front of his central pawns. And the general rule is when you're playing closed openings, you want to keep your pieces behind your pawns. So in this game, we have a closed opening because we have no open or semi-open files. So the board is not locked. There's only two pawns that are up against each other on c4 and c5. But the position is closed because there's no open or semi-open files. So he probably would want to put his king-knight behind his pawns here. There's nothing wrong with playing knight f6, but combining knight f6 with bishop e6 is a little awkward. So obviously I play d3. And he does play knight f6. And now I have a choice. I can play f4 first, followed by knight f3. Or I can just play knight 1 on e2 like a Botvinnik system and give myself the flexibility of whether I want to push the f-pawn or not. So I decide to keep with the Botvinnik system and play knight on 1 to e2. And Steve castles queenside. Kingside, sorry. And I could castle kingside here, but Stockfish says it's more accurate to play b4 right away. And I did. I played b4. And my opening advantage here has grown to about 8 or 9/10 of a pawn, which is a little more than double a normal advantage. So that means that, if both sides play perfectly, I have some pretty good winning chances here. Stockfish says Steve should now play queen to c8. Steve plays queen to d7. All right, Engine says I should play h3 here. I play b5 right away. Engine says, not accurate, Dan. Your advantage is dropping a little bit. Black should put the knight in the middle. If he did that, I was planning on taking the knight, letting him double his pawns, and then moving my other knight back. Knight d4. But Stockfish says I shouldn't take the knight. If I play knight takes, pawn takes, knight e2, Stockfish says bishop h3, castle, e5, perfectly even for black. So it says if I'm going to take the pawn here, I should play knight to d5. Let him double my pawns with knight takes, pawn takes, bishop h3 again, castle, bishop takes g2, king takes g2. Very slight advantage for white, maybe a normal opening advantage. Okay, so that's what should have happened. But instead of putting his knight on d4, Steve makes a mistake. He plays knight to e5. And knight e5 almost loses a piece. I've played games like this before. And the knight on e5 is awkward because I can play f4, and if he plays knight on 5 to g4, I can play h3, and if he plays knight h6, he has another piece in front of his pawns, and I can take advantage of that. So let's see what happened in the game. I thought for 4.5 minutes, and I played f4. He plays knight g4. I play h3. He plays knight h6. So now white can win a piece. If you don't see how white can win a piece, you can pause the video and see if you can guess it. I saw that I could win a piece. At least I'm pretty sure I saw I could win a piece. I must have seen it. I took a while on this move, 3 minutes, and I put a note saying I wasn't sure what to play. And the computer says I should not win the piece right away. It gives the very strange move, queen to d2 with the winning position. I saw that winning the piece right away was not that good. So when I say not that good, maybe not my best move, the way to win a piece is to play g4 threatening g5. He can't play g5 himself. I just take it and I win a piece. And his knights have nowhere to go. If he plays knight to e8, which is his only safe knight move, I can play f5, trapping his bishop. Pawn takes. And now I could trap his knight. The computer actually says better to trap the knight than the bishop with g5. And I win a piece. So that's what I could have done. Instead, and in this position, what he should do is sack his knight for 2 pawns. And, I'm winning this position, but I have to be a little bit careful about my king because my pawns are up all over the board, and, my kingside pawns are the ones that are missing. So I thought I could just get away with playing bishop e3 first. And Stockfish says, yes, bishop e3 is at least as good as g4, if not better. So playing bishop e3 is not a bad idea. Now I have multiple ways that I'm threatening to win material. And black doesn't have a lot of wonderful things he can do. The engine says he should play king h8 so that his knight can go back to g8, but obviously very awkward. Humans don't usually play that way, although I guess if he feels that's the only way to save the piece. So he plays knight to e8. And already my opponent's used almost about 40% of his time for the whole game, and he hasn't finished his development. So he plays knight e8, and I think for a while now, I think for 7 minutes, and I decide to temporarily sack a pawn so I can win the knight. The idea on f5 is I'm trapping the bishop, And the only way to save it is to take this pawn, but then when I play queen d2 and hit this knight, it has nowhere to go. And I'll end up winning a piece for 2 pawns. So I play queen to d2. He plays g takes f. I play queen to d2. He plays f takes e4. He has nothing better. He has no way to save the knight. So he plays f takes e4, and now if I play bishop takes h6, my queen would be overworked between guarding d3 and h6. So you have to be patient in these kind of positions. What I did was I simply took back on e4 with the pawn to prevent the knight from going to f5, and I was willing to give up, I shouldn't say sacrifice since he's the one losing the piece. I'm willing to give up my pawn on c4 to save the pawn on e4. So I take on e4, and now the only way he can get a second pawn for his piece is to play bishop takes c4. So he does. He plays bishop takes c4. He took 7.5 minutes on that move, even though it's relatively forced. So now he's got 31.5 minutes left. And of course, now I have to win the piece before it runs away. Bishop takes h6. And Stockfish says he should play bishop takes h6. He plays a6, which I think surprised me a little. I'm not sure what he's quite trying to do. Maybe weaken my pawns on the queen side. So I decided to keep my b pawn here, and I played b6. That also keeps the knight out of c7 in some lines. And now he played bishop takes h6, and I played queen takes h6. So we have a position where he has 7 pawns, I have 5. Both kings are a little bit loosey-goosey. But I have that extra piece. And when you have an extra piece early in the game, pieces are worth a lot more than pawns early in the game. Pawns gain in value as you get toward the end game. So this is completely one for me. The engine says I'm up by about 3.5 pawns. And the rest of the game won't even be that interesting except for the fact that I decided to make it a little fun, which is one of the reasons I'm showing it to you. Okay, so in this position, he brings his knight back into the game with knight g7. And I decide if he's going to break with f5 and get his rook in the game and possibly stop me from castling, that could be a little bit of an annoyance, and it would also help his knight. So I played g4 to try to discourage him from playing f5. And Steve immediately, I shouldn't say immediately, but he plays e6 with the idea of trying to force himself to play f5. So now I have a little bit of a clearance idea. What I want to do is, if I can get my knight to f6, it's checkmate, because knight f6 check, king h8, queen takes h7 is mate. So what I do is I play a clearance move, e5. And now if he takes that pawn, I have lots of good moves here. The computer says my best is to play queen f6 and block his f-pawn. Or I could play queen e3 and hit 2 of his pawns. If I play knight e4, he can play f5, knight g5, knight e8 to guard the h7 pawn, and rook c1, and I'm completely winning, but that's probably not my best line. To block the pawn here is thematic. Play queen f6. Now if he plays knight e8 again, I can play check, king h8. Computer says play rook d1 first. Bishop d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5, and now it plays the crazy move, castles. Funny move, and it says I'm up almost 7 pawns. All right, so let's go back to the game. So Steve didn't like any of that stuff, and he decides he wants to take this e4 square away from me, so I can't put my knight or my bishop there and go after his h7 and f6 squares. So he plays d5. At this point, he has only 9 minutes left with his 5-second time delay. So I have 33.5 minutes left. I thought for a while, and I castled. That puts my rook on the f6 square. It does pin my knight on e2, but I'm not too worried about that. Knight's guarded. So Steve decides he doesn't want my pieces getting onto this diagonal and possibly mating him on h7. So he plays bishop d3. and I play rook a d1. And he guards the bishop with c4, and I bring my knight up to d4. I'm willing to give up these pawns on b6 in order to get my pieces onto the king side here. I'm starting to think already of having some sacrifices. For instance, let's say he plays queen d8, which the computer says is his best move. Stockfish says I should just play rook f2, saving that rook. By the way, I guess I should point out, if when he plays d4 and I play knight d4, suppose he plays bishop takes f1. Well, that ruins his defense. He's giving up a defender and I'm getting an extra attacker. So even though he wins the exchange, he's really in trouble here. For instance, queen d8 again to go after this pawn and try to pin the knight. Stockfish says rook f4. If he tries to take this pawn, knight takes d5, he can't take me. Let's say he plays queen c5 and then knight f6 check, king h8, checkmate. And there's other ways he can play, but bishop takes f1. I wasn't too worried about it. I saw lots of ways. I was going to sack the exchange anyway. So I'm perfectly happy when he gives up defenders of the king side in a position like this. All right, so Steve didn't take it. He played c4, as we said. I played knight d4. He plays queen e7. Okay, so it looks like black has a little bit of a solid position. But here I decided I was going to start having some fun and playing a Sac-Fest. So you heard me just say that I was willing to give up my rook on f1 for the bishop on d3. And since he was unwilling to take it, I said, okay, in that case, I'll force you to give up that bishop for a rook. I'll play rook takes d3. So Steve plays e takes d3, and now I said, wow, this is neat. I could play bishop e4 and threaten mate, and if he takes me, I can take back with the knight, and then threatening to mate him or win the queen. I could play rook to f6 first, or I could play knight to e4 first, and if he takes it, I can take back with the bishop and hit h7. I wasn't sure which was the most accurate move order. Stockfish says the most accurate is to put the knight there, threatening knight f6 check. If he takes, and I take, and now I'm threatening mate, if he moves the rook, I can mate him anyway because the knight's in the way. So he can't move the rook. So he has to play something like f5. And then I could take en passant, forking the queen and the knight. If he plays queen f7, that blocks him and he gets mated, so he can't do that. If he moves the queen somewhere else, queen c5, checkmate, can't do that. Let's say he plays queen to d7, threatening queen takes d4 check. Check, here, checkmate. Okay, so Stockfish says that's the most accurate, and I certainly looked at that. So I decided to put the other piece there first. I played bishop e4. So I've just sacked the exchange, and now I'm going to sack the bishop. And Steve says, gee, I have nothing better than to take that bishop because you're threatening mate, and we already saw some of the lines where he doesn't take it. For instance, if he plays f5 now, he takes f6, forking the queen and the knight, threatening to take on h7 again, bad news. So Steve took the bishop. Of course, I took back with a knight, and now I'm threatening knight f6 check, and if he moves the king, queen takes h7 mate. So I sack the exchange, and then I sack the piece, and if he pushes the f-pawn, again, I take it either en passant or on f6. So Steve decides to just play knight e8 so that he can guard at the f6 square with his knight. The problem is that I don't need my knight there. As long as I have a pawn there, I can mate. So I play knight checks. Now again, king h8, queen takes h7 is checkmate. If he plays knight takes, I played pawn takes, threatening the queen and threatening mate. So I'm winning the queen for a pawn if he does that anyway. So he decides to get a knight for his queen, and he plays queen takes f6. Okay, so I play e takes f6. And of course I got a million threats here. But one of my fun threats is to sack another piece on f5. So Steve plays rook ad8, hitting my knight and threatening to push his pawn down. Right now he only has a rook for a queen, but he has an extra pawn and it's a dangerous pawn. And I said, oh, I'd like to put something on f5 and try to mate him. Should I put my rook on f5 or my knight on f5? Well, I think both of them win. The Stockfish says knight f5 is the most accurate. Now I'm threatening knight e7 check, king h8, queen takes f8 mate. If he takes the knight, I take with the rook, threatening rook checks, followed by queen mate. So he has to move the knight now. Let's say he plays... Well, he can't play knight f6 because rook g5 check, king h8, queen g7 is mate. So he'd have to move the knight somewhere else. Let's say he moves... Well, he can't move the knight anywhere because I take the pawn. So he has really no defense against rook checks, followed by queen takes f8 mate. Okay, so I said, well, I could sack the knight. Let's offer him my rook and my knight. So I play rook f5. All right, if he takes the knight, then I have rook g5 check, king h8, queen takes f8 mate again. If he takes the rook, and I take with the knight, I'm threatening knight checks, king h8, queen takes f8 mate again, and he still can't move the knight because of queen g7 mate. And if he does nothing, if he plays d2, I have him rook g5 check, king h8, queen takes f8 mate again. So after I sack the rook with rook f5, Steve decides to take it. I take with the knight, threatening knight check. He plays his best move, rook d7, which doesn't save the game, but he has nothing better. I play knight e7 check. Now if he plays king h8, of course we have our friendly queen takes f8 mate again. So he plays rook takes e7. I play f takes e7. And now he can avoid mate with knight g7, but of course then he's losing the rook to the pawn, and I'm going to pick up this d pawn and win easily. So Steve resigned here. We can show you what Stockfish would do. Knight g7, ef8 queen, king takes, queen d6 check, king e8, queen b8 check, king d7, queen b7 check, king d6, queen c7 check, king e6, b7, d2, queen to d8, stopping him from getting a queen. He gets one anyway just to prolong the mate. Queen takes d1, king f6, you get the idea, b8 queen, knight e6, queen on d to d6, king to g7. I'm just playing Stockfish's best moves. Queen e5 check, f6, queen takes e6, a5, queen on b to g8 check. By the way, when you have two queens and your opponent only has a king, very often the fastest way to mate him is take the queen that's the furthest away and bring it to the closest safe square that's check. So in this case, queen on b8 to g8 check would follow that rule. King h6, and now take the one that's further away, checkmate. Okay, so in this position, Steve resigned. So if we go back to we can now see why knight e5 was such a bad move. It looked like it was a nice centralizing knight. But he's got too many pieces in front of his pawns here. Knight e5, I play f4. He can't go anywhere except g4. I get h3. He plays knight h6. And now he has all these knights fighting my pawns. If you don't understand why in closed positions you want your pieces behind your pawns, notice I have all 8 of my non-pawns behind my 8 pawns, and I've moved all 8 of my pawns in the first 13 moves. A lot of people are like, oh, you can't move 8 pawns in the first 13 moves. That's weakening. Well, here, it's not weakening. My pawns are completely controlling the space of the board. And if you've never seen a game like this, this is a good game to study, to see how the pawns control the space against the pieces. And even though I could have played g4 here and won a pawn right away, I was in no hurry. Stockfish says bishop e3 is, if anything, better than playing g4. And now he just has all his pieces tripping over each other. If his pawns were in the way, if his pawns were, let's say we change this position and put his pawns on f5 and e5 instead of on f7 and e7, well, then he's got a perfectly reasonable game because he's fighting with me for space. But here, his pieces just can't fight against my pieces for space. So if you've never heard that rule before, which is in closed positions, I don't mean locked positions, I mean closed positions, that it's positions where there's no open or semi-open file, you want to try to keep your pieces as best possible behind your pawns. So this is no exception. After bishop e3, knight e8, f5, g takes f5, queen d2, the knight is trapped. Pawn takes, bishop takes, and I won a piece for 2 pawns, and as you saw, I won nicely with all my sacrifices. Let's just show that one more time because I thought it was kind of pretty. Okay, bishop takes h6, a6, b6, bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, knight g7, g4, e6, e5, d5, castle, bishop d3, rook a d1, c4, knight to d4, sacking the exchange, so that's 1 sack. Queen e7, rook takes d3, forcing it, that's 2 sacks. Bishop e4, sacrificing another piece, that's 3 sacks. Knight takes e4, knight e8, knight f6 check, queen takes, pawn takes, rook a d8, and here's my, 5th sack, rook f5, he takes, knight takes, rook d7, knight checks, rook takes, pawn takes, and after my 5 sacrifices, when the smoke clears, I'm way ahead. Okay, so I got a little Sac-Fest there, and that's probably a good name for the video. Alright, so if you liked the game or the video, please hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you can hit the subscribe. I think this is my 108th video. Last few weeks I've been making about 1 per week. And if you've missed some of the earlier videos, I'm covering almost all the most important ideas for improving your game. Ideas on, how to think, how to play safely, how to recognize whether things are safe or not, time management, how to slow down if you're playing too fast, how to speed up if you're playing too slow, just all kinds of stuff. I'm going over some of my games, some famous games, some amateur games, a little bit of everything for everyone. All right, thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.